Mexico, 1890. The streets were narrow, the nights were long, and trust was a fragile thing. In a quiet district where oil lamps flickered against stone walls, a woman moved through society with elegance, patience, and a face that inspired confidence. Her name was Guadalupe Bejarano. To some she was refined, respectable, soft-spoken. To others she was generous, helpful, almost saintly. But history would remember her differently. In the late 19th century, Mexico was a nation divided between tradition and modernization. Wealthy families guarded their reputations fiercely. Servants moved silently through grand homes. And women, especially those who appeared educated and composed, were rarely suspected of darkness. Guadalupe understood this better than anyone. She dressed modestly but with care. Her voice was calm, her eyes steady. She knew how to speak to widows about grief, to businessmen about investments, to young women about opportunity. And most importantly, she knew how to listen. Listening built trust. Trust opened doors, and doors led to something far more sinister. Rumors would later describe how she carefully inserted herself into households, offering assistance, friendship, advice, sometimes even financial guidance. Then quietly, valuables would disappear, money would vanish, documents would be altered. But that was only the beginning. Because Guadalupe wasn't driven only by greed, she was driven by control. In a society where women had limited power, she found a way to manipulate the system from within, not through force, not through violence, at least not at first, through intelligence, through deception, through patience. By the mid-1890s, whispers began circulating among the elite families of Mexico City. A pattern, a presence, a woman who appeared just before fortunes shifted and disappeared just before tragedy struck. But still, no one suspected her. After all, she was the lady who fooled everyone, and the nightmare had only just begun. By 1891, Guadalupe had already established a delicate network of influence. She would visit families under the pretense of charity or education, sometimes bringing small gifts or advice. But behind the smiles there was calculation. One wealthy household, the Herrera family, became her first true test. The father, Don Julio Herrera, was known for his stern demeanor and sharp mind. His wife, Isabella, was gentle but naive, always trusting strangers with a warm heart. Guadalupe observed them for weeks, noting habits, routines, and weaknesses. She learned when the household slept, when servants were absent, and when valuables were easiest to access. Her approach was subtle. She didn't rush. She didn't alarm anyone. Instead, she engaged in conversations that built dependence. Isabella began to confide in her, seeking guidance on family matters. Don Julio, impressed by her apparent intelligence, welcomed her opinions on business affairs. It was in these small interactions that Guadalupe began planting seeds of influence. She suggested rearranging valuables for safety or handling correspondence to avoid mistakes. Gradually, she positioned herself as indispensable. Then came the first disappearances. A string of small items initially, jewelry, a few coins, papers, nothing that would immediately trigger suspicion. But the household began noticing minor inconsistencies. A ledger entry missing here, a misplaced key there. Guadalupe offered solutions, calmly, always restoring trust and appearing helpful. This pattern repeated in other households. Soon, a network of families unknowingly fell under her control, believing Guadalupe to be a guardian of order and wisdom. Yet the real horror lay beneath the surface. Guadalupe's influence extended beyond theft or manipulation. She observed her victims, learned their secrets, and sometimes used them to exert psychological control. She understood the fragility of trust and the power of fear. By 1893, Guadalupe had become nearly untouchable. Rumors began, whispered behind closed doors. Families losing money, reputations tarnished, unexplained misfortunes. But no one could connect the dots. The lady who fooled everyone had mastered invisibility. Still, each action, each carefully placed suggestion, each stolen coin moved her closer to something much darker. A darkness that would leave the elite of Mexico questioning not only their wealth, but their own sanity. And the true scale of Guadalupe Bejarano's influence was yet to be revealed. By 1894, Guadalupe's schemes had grown bolder. She no longer limited herself to observing and subtly manipulating. The families she visited were now under her almost complete psychological control. Some even began seeking her approval for major decisions, unknowingly giving her influence over their lives and fortunes. One particular household, the Salazar family, became a key turning point. The father, Don Emilio Salazar, was skeptical of outsiders, but Guadalupe quickly found a way in. She offered advice on his business dealings, correcting errors in his letters and contracts. Slowly, he began to rely on her judgment over his own. Meanwhile, she focused on the children. Young Alejandro and Sofia adored her, seeing her as a mysterious mentor. Guadalupe encouraged obedience and subtle competition between them, fostering dependency while sowing seeds of distrust toward their parents. Outside the Salazar home, whispers grew. Neighbors began noticing the family acting strangely. Minor quarrels, sudden generosity, and secretive meetings with Guadalupe. Still, no one dared confront her. She had cultivated the perfect image of benevolence. Guadalupe also expanded her network beyond Mexico City. Families in Puebla, Oaxaca, and Veracruz reported similar experiences: unexpected guidance from a mysterious woman, minor thefts, and strange psychological influence over household decisions. Each family thought they were unique victims, unaware of the wider pattern. By 1895, her influence had become legendary in secret circles. She was the invisible force controlling multiple families, the ghostly figure in social gatherings who knew more than anyone should. Her ability to blend kindness with subtle manipulation was unmatched. But Guadalupe's ambitions were far from satisfied. Her ultimate goal involved not just wealth or influence, but a demonstration of total control, a network so tightly woven that any attempt to break it would unravel both family reputations and societal norms. Every gift she offered, every word of advice, and every calculated gesture moved her closer to an apex of power. The horror was not in the thefts or lies, but in how deeply she infiltrated the minds and routines of her victims. By 1896, Guadalupe Bejarano was no longer merely a mysterious visitor. She had become the puppet master of entire households, a shadow over the elite of Mexico, and the architect of a chilling legacy that would haunt the region for decades to come. By late 1896, something began to shift. It started with fear, not loud fear, not public scandal, but quiet, private anxiety. Families who once welcomed Guadalupe with open arms now began noticing patterns. Whenever she became deeply involved in a household, something would change. Investments failed, jewelry disappeared, servants were dismissed after sudden accusations. Trust inside the home would fracture, yet strangely, Guadalupe always emerged untouched. One evening, a widow named Doña Mercedes confronted her gently about missing inheritance documents. Guadalupe did not panic. She did not deny it aggressively. Instead, she turned the situation around with calm precision. She implied that perhaps a servant had been careless. Perhaps a distant relative had motives. Perhaps grief was clouding judgment. Within minutes, suspicion shifted away from her. This was her true weapon: psychological redirection. But beneath the manipulation, her schemes were becoming riskier. In one household, she allegedly convinced a father to transfer temporary financial authority to her for protection. Days later, significant funds were untraceable. In another, a young woman suddenly cut ties with her family after prolonged private guidance from Guadalupe. Letters later revealed deep emotional dependence. Mexico City's elite began whispering more openly now. There was no proof, no evidence strong enough to accuse her publicly, but the pattern was undeniable. And then, something unexpected happened. A clerk from a banking office noticed irregular signatures linked to multiple estates. Different families. Similar handwriting adjustments. The name appearing repeatedly in correspondence. Guadalupe Bejarano. For the first time, the illusion cracked. Authorities were hesitant. A respected woman, educated, socially polished. Accusing her without concrete proof would cause scandal. But quiet inquiries began. Discreet questions, subtle surveillance, conversations with dismissed servants. Guadalupe sensed it. The air around her was no longer comfortable. Invitations slowed. Eyes lingered longer when she entered a room. For the first time in years, she was being watched. And when a master manipulator realizes the game is changing, they do not retreat quietly. They escalate. By early 1897, Guadalupe made a decision that would transform suspicion into full investigation. And what she did next would ensure her name would never be forgotten. By early 1897, Guadalupe's carefully constructed web began to face its first real challenges. A series of missing valuables and unexplained financial shifts drew the attention of local authorities. Though many families feared scandal more than theft, a few braved the truth and spoke up. Their stories shared a common thread: a single woman who appeared trustworthy, guiding households, and quietly taking control. Investigators approached the first few families discreetly, collecting statements. Servants and widows provided accounts of her movements, her suggestions, and the subtle ways she influenced decisions. The patterns were chilling: strategic placement in households, psychological manipulation, and theft executed with impeccable timing. Guadalupe, ever observant, sensed the scrutiny. She shifted tactics. Her appearances became more calculated, more selective. She offered less advice, presented herself with a renewed aura of innocence. Her confidence, almost theatrical, masked the rising tension. Yet cracks were forming. Financial documents had traces of her involvement. Transactions and letters linked her to multiple incidents across Mexico City. Even as she smiled politely at investigators and socialites, the walls of her empire were closing in. It was during a seemingly ordinary meeting with the Estrada family that her first major mistake occurred. A ledger she had corrected contained errors. Traces of her handwriting were noted. A keen-eyed clerk documented the inconsistencies. For the first time, someone had tangible evidence connecting Guadalupe directly to the irregularities. Rumors escalated rapidly among the elite. The whispers of "the lady who fooled everyone" turned to concern, and concern turned to fear. Families began securing valuables, monitoring correspondence, and questioning her presence in their homes. Guadalupe, however, remained unflappable. She had always thrived under pressure. The question now was simple: would her skill and cunning be enough to escape a system finally alert to her methods? The hunt had begun, and the legend of Guadalupe Bejarano was about to enter its most dramatic phase. By mid-1897, the web of influence Guadalupe had spun across Mexico City could no longer remain invisible. Authorities had enough testimonies and evidence to take action. Servants, widows, and clerks collaborated cautiously, revealing patterns of manipulation, theft, and subtle psychological control. The first official summons was sent discreetly. Guadalupe, ever poised, received it with calm composure. No sign of panic, no sign of guilt. Investigators arrived at her residence with precise timing. They observed her interactions, her words, gestures, and demeanor. Even under scrutiny, she maintained her facade of benevolence. The same soft voice, the same polished manners. Yet, evidence spoke louder than appearances. Ledgers, letters, and testimonies documented a meticulous trail of deceit. Multiple families, once trusting and welcoming, were now considered victims. Guadalupe attempted to redirect suspicion. She suggested clerical errors, misplaced documents, even subtle misunderstandings among family members. Her arguments were articulate, almost persuasive. But the investigators were prepared. They had patterns, connections, and evidence she could not manipulate away. The tension reached its peak during a private confrontation. Investigators confronted her with inconsistencies in her accounts, her handwriting traced across multiple ledgers, and the testimony of several witnesses corroborating her calculated presence in households. Guadalupe's expression remained composed. A faint smile lingered, a signature of her confidence, her belief that she could still turn the game in her favor. The room was thick with anticipation. The investigators, cautious yet firm, outlined her actions, her manipulations, and the undeniable connections across multiple families. For the first time, the world saw the real scope of her control. It was not just theft, not just influence. It was a calculated psychological domination that spanned years. And in that moment, Guadalupe Bejarano, the lady who fooled everyone, faced the undeniable reality. Her empire of subtle terror had been uncovered. The trial of Guadalupe Bejarano became a spectacle. Newspapers across Mexico City reported the story of the woman who had infiltrated the homes of the elite. Headlines read, "The lady who fooled everyone." Courtrooms were packed. Families she had manipulated testified. Witnesses described her elegance, her calculated kindness, and the subtle ways she gained control. Every word painted a portrait of a woman whose intelligence and patience had enabled a reign of quiet terror. Guadalupe, true to form, remained composed. Her voice was steady, her demeanor calm. She answered questions with precision, almost rehearsed, displaying a mastery of rhetoric that left some in awe, others in frustration. Psychologists and social commentators of the time began analyzing her behavior. They described her as a master manipulator, using charm and subtle psychological pressure to dominate households without physical violence. Her ability to exploit trust and societal expectations of women was unprecedented. The trial revealed the scale of her influence. Families ruined financially, children emotionally scarred, and reputations tarnished, all orchestrated by a single cunning woman. Yet many could not reconcile her polished, composed appearance with the havoc she had wreaked. Outside the courthouse, whispers spread through the streets. Citizens debated, could someone so refined truly commit such acts? Or was this a reflection of society's blind trust in appearances? Inside, Guadalupe continued to assert her innocence. Her arguments were meticulous. Her knowledge of family dynamics, social norms, and legal loopholes kept the courtroom on edge. Even the judges were impressed by her composure and intellect. But evidence was mounting. Multiple testimonies, traced handwriting, and patterns of theft were undeniable. The psychological manipulation that had gone unnoticed for years was now exposed under the harsh light of scrutiny. As the trial progressed, the public fascination grew. People were drawn to the story of a woman who had fooled everyone, who had moved silently through households, shaping decisions and fortunes with subtle precision. It was a story that blurred the line between genius and villainy. By the end of the trial, Guadalupe Bejarano's legend had solidified, not just as a criminal, but as a symbol of cunning, control, and the power of trust abused. The court delivered its verdict. Guadalupe Bejarano was found guilty of multiple counts of theft, fraud, and psychological manipulation. The sentence was severe, yet fitting for the meticulous and calculated crimes she had committed over nearly a decade. Families affected by her schemes finally felt a measure of justice. Many reclaimed part of their lost fortunes. Others sought emotional closure after the subtle manipulations had left long-lasting scars. Guadalupe herself faced her fate with the same composure she had shown throughout her life. She accepted the judgment calmly, as if she were aware that her story, her legend, would endure far beyond the courtroom walls. Historians would later describe her not merely as a criminal, but as a phenomenon, a woman who mastered the art of influence in a society that underestimated her because of her gender. Her story became a cautionary tale about trust, appearances, and the fragility of human perception. Over time, Guadalupe Bejarano's name was whispered in elite circles, referenced in cautionary tales for generations. The lady who fooled everyone had left an indelible mark on Mexican society, a legacy of intelligence, cunning, and subtle terror that fascinated, horrified, and intrigued all who heard her tale. And though decades passed, the story endured, not for the wealth she took, not for the lives she manipulated, but for the lesson she left behind, that even the most trusted face can hide the deepest shadows. Guadalupe Bejarano, a name remembered forever, stands as a testament to the power of subtlety, patience, and the quiet art of control. Beyond the courtroom and the headlines, Guadalupe Bejarano's story offers a glimpse into the psychology of influence and manipulation. Psychologists studying her methods noted her remarkable ability to exploit trust. She understood human nature, how people respond to kindness, authority, and subtle guidance. Her manipulations were almost surgical. Each suggestion, each gesture, each word calculated to elicit obedience or dependence without raising alarm. Society at the time was structured in a way that allowed her to flourish. Women were often underestimated in matters of finance and decision-making. Families, valuing appearances and social etiquette, rarely suspected that someone so refined could operate with such precision and subtlety. Her crimes were not violent in the traditional sense, yet they caused deep emotional and financial scars. Trust, once broken, left long-term consequences for the families she infiltrated. Her ability to hide behind a mask of generosity and refinement highlights how perception can be manipulated as effectively as action. Guadalupe's legacy is twofold. On one hand, she is remembered as a criminal, a master manipulator whose cunning left its mark on history. On the other, she is studied as a case in psychological strategy, influence, and the power of patience and observation. The story of the lady who fooled everyone reminds us that power is not always visible. It is often quiet, patient, and hidden behind the most unsuspecting faces. And even today, her tale serves as a chilling lesson. True control can be subtle. True influence can be silent. And the shadows of a single person's cunning can echo through decades, leaving stories that continue to fascinate, horrify, and teach. As the years passed, the tale of Guadalupe Bejarano became legend. She was no longer just a criminal. She was a symbol, a reminder of how appearances can deceive, how trust can be weaponized, and how the quietest manipulations can leave the deepest scars. Families once under her influence rebuilt their lives, yet the memory of subtle control lingered. Even descendants spoke in hushed tones about the lady who fooled everyone, the woman whose calm demeanor masked a mind of extraordinary calculation. Her story challenges us to look beyond the surface, to question what we assume to be safe, to recognize that intelligence and cunning can be both captivating and terrifying. And perhaps the most chilling lesson of all, the greatest influence is often invisible. The most powerful control is exercised quietly, with patience, observation, and unwavering confidence. Guadalupe Bejarano's legacy endures, echoing through the corridors of history. A cautionary tale for generations, and a dark chapter in Mexico's past that reminds us, even in the brightest homes, shadows can dwell. Even the most trusted faces may conceal secrets. Her story is not just about crime. It is about human nature, societal blind spots, and the unsettling truth that sometimes the deadliest force is subtlety itself. History remembers the name, but it also whispers the lesson. That control, patience, and cunning can leave a mark far beyond the reach of time.